Chapter 3 The Shamanic Tradition. The Birdman's Descendants. The magician is the archetype behind a multitude of human professions and callings. The magician urges us on into the unseen. He is the mediator and communicator of hidden knowledge, the healer, technologist, teacher, and contemplative. He is behind our insatiable human curiosity. He keeps his inner eye fixed on the blueprint for the self, image of God, or diamond body we each have within us, and he seeks to initiate us into a wiser, fuller way of being human. Whenever a person manipulates hidden forces in his profession, whether those be psychological or physical, he is accessing the magician. Many professions operate under his aegis. Scientists, technicians, mathematicians, cosmologists, lawyers, physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, philosophers, teachers, researchers, economists, sociologists, politicians, priests, prophets, shamans, psychics, artists. All these professions and more express and utilize the energies of the magician. Those professions which emphasize mental discipline and technical proficiency are also heavily influenced by the warrior, the archetype of self-discipline and perseverance. A few magician professions rely more on the feeling and relating qualities typical of the lover. Artists are especially under the magician and the lover's combined sway. With the lover to guide them, they key into the underlying libidinal unity of all things, and the magician provides a deep connection with the unconscious. The lover's intuition of the unity of time and space, in which past, present, and future are experienced as a single moment, and all points in the universe as ultimately coincidental, is also expressed in the magician's manifestation as prophet, seer, or psychic. The medicine men and the rainmakers of traditional cultures work equally in the dimension of introverted self-discipline and extroverted caring commitment to a greater community. Other holy men, yogis, for example, follow rigorous ascetic disciplines that impel them into a relationship centered in a transcendental reality. Analogous contemporary professions are those of the teacher, psychologist, psychiatrist, and physician. Politicians and salesmen also draw on the magician's skills at manipulating appearances. Both can make things appear to be what they are not, but hopefully they have enough contact with the king to remember the greater good of the community. The priesthoods of every religion traditionally have been concerned with mediating to their flocks the power of the spirit world, what we would call the collective unconscious. Many priests, of course, draw on the warrior as well as the magician. Think of the Jesuits, an order founded explicitly as soldiers of Christ. The main requirement for the priesthood has always been proficiency in the evocation, containment, and distribution of magician power, but not necessarily direct experience of it. In contrast, prophets, seers, psychics, and religious poets are directly acquainted with that power and live their lives in deep communion with the archetype. The priest is more concerned with structure, established ceremony, where these other spiritual individuals look for ecstatic communion and engage in transformative rituals. Such ecstatic communion is almost always in tension with structure. Hence the conflicts throughout history between prophets and priests. Technically oriented professionals work with knowledge that is generally unknown outside of a given profession. Technology is the magician's specialty, and the application and drive required to master a highly technological profession is supplied by the warrior. The lover has little influence over such a profession. Though many individuals in these walks of life may be intensely relational in their personal lives, their work tends to be removed from the dimension of human feeling. Responsibility is as limited as the focus is narrow in these kinds of jobs. The work is seldom directly concerned with serving others. Of course, there are exceptions. The researcher who tries to come up with a cure for AIDS, or the public defender who labors to establish a useful precedent. But most usually, the concerns of these professions are limited in scope. The lover energy only gives to these men their sudden insights and unexpected solutions to difficult problems. The magician energy is the most introverted energy of the four foundational archetypes of the masculine psyche. It can be the most difficult energy to understand, since it requires more patience and subtlety of mind than the lover, warrior, or king energy. One of the reasons practitioners tend to mystify the archetypal magician is to counteract our short attention spans. They try to impress us with their mystifications so that we won't lose interest in what it is the magician actually does. E. M. Butler was one scholar who didn't fall into the trap of trying to make his subject mysterious. In his book, The Myth of the Magus, he set out 10 elements common to the stories of all the great historical magicians. From Jesus to the anonymous shamans we will soon examine, the myths of a magician's life remain remarkably consistent. First, a magician's origin is supernatural or mysterious. He may be a divine or a demonic infant, but he is never ordinary. Second, there are portents at his birth to indicate his mysterious origins and his supernatural powers. For example, when Muhammad was born, the story is that all the idols of the world fell down. In a more familiar tradition, think of the star that led the 3 magi to the baby Jesus. The third common element is that the baby magus is imperiled in his infancy. Evil wishes, or simply the power of evil, try to do the magus in at birth. A fourth element is some kind of initiation. Austerities and temptations occur which are either preceded or followed by a 5th stage of distant wanderings. The magus wanders either to seek for wisdom or to spread wisdom he has already acquired. The journeys may be supernatural. They may involve a descent into the underworld or an ascent into heaven. Again, it is easy to locate Jesus in this tradition. Allegedly, he went into the underworld. The esoteric traditions of the Gnostics tell of a Jesus who journeyed to India to study with the sages there. Other stories tell that Jesus went to the Himalayas and was initiated there. The place for initiation in the Himalayas would be, of course, the legendary secret chamber that opens into Shangri-La. In his 6th stage, a magus faces a magical contest. Butler maintains that this is a constant feature in the lives of all magicians, both legendary and real. He offers, for example, the biblical contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. The 7th stage almost always holds a trial or a persecution. 8th, there is a last scene, which often includes a solemn and prophetic farewell. The Last Supper clearly fits into this 8th stage. In the 9th stage, there is often a violent or a mysterious death, and in the 10th, a resurrection or an ascension. These last stages throw a very interesting light on human nature. Why a trial or a persecution? Because human beings are virtuosos of denial. People work very carefully to be unaware of any problem when awareness might require taking an active part in finding a solution. The trial comes because the magician knows too many uncomfortable truths and calls for action. An individual becomes a community scapegoat when he reveals his community's shadow. If we consider the story of Jesus in this respect, we see a man who knows a lot, reveals a lot, and is killed for his efforts. But interestingly, the myth's 10th stage suggests how hard it is to kill the truth. There is a vindication at the story's end, because the magus comes back, transcending his torturers, and it is his truth that ultimately is remembered. The magician as shaman. There is no archetype of the shaman, as some would argue. He is only one of the magician's many faces, along with the medicine man, the warlock, the wizard, therapist, or physicist. But the shaman's calling is, of all human professions, the fullest expression of the magician archetype. The shaman was first studied by anthropologists among the indigenous tribes of Central and Northern Asia. The term is taken from the language of a Siberian tribe. Subsequently, shamans have been identified in traditional cultures from Australia and the Cape of Africa to the Yucatan. Many scholars now theorize that shamanism is the psycho-spiritual phenomenon underlying the emergence of history's great spiritual traditions. Science, ancient and modern, always owes a debt to the intuitive insights of the shaman. The shaman was the guardian of esoteric knowledge and the technician of sacred power. His secret wisdom was of natural laws and psychological dynamics. The shaman knew and could interpret the cycles of nature, the workings of the heavens, the phases of the moon, the progress of the sun, and perhaps most important, the movements of the herds upon which the lives of his people depended. It was the shaman who was called upon to locate, consecrate, and steward the sacred places and times, which periodically would erupt into ordinary time and space. The shaman understood that the human psyche is made up of energy flows and dynamic structures which can be brought into harmonious integration with one another. He called the structures he encountered demons, angels, or spirits. Today we would call these same things neuroses, complexes, and archetypes. He conducted his research into the hidden worlds of nature and the psyche by altering his consciousness, often by rhythmic drumming, and less often by the use of hallucinogenic drugs. His inward questing forced him to integrate his own fragmented psyche and confront his own complexes. In fact, it was often a childhood nervous illness that marked a boy as a possible heir to an elder shaman. Butler's first and second mythic stages can be located in a boy's psychic illness, in its mysterious origin and its portents of gathering supernatural powers. Instead of curing the illness, the elder shaman would encourage it to run its course, thus giving the pupil a practical lesson in the healing dynamics of the human psyche. But a shaman's primary objective was helping his fellow tribe members. He communicated his ecstatic visions and his diagnoses of the illnesses afflicting his fellows and their world through poetry and song. Thus, he was healer, artist, and technician, the magician par excellence. By virtue of his spiritual power, he also became economic advisor, designer, architect, and politician. In fact, he was consulted in every matter of importance to the community as a whole. Many times, the magician is expressed through individuals who would rather study a problem than solve one. The shaman is the most developed embodiment of the magician because of the problems he is willing to take on. He has the capacity to care, which comes from the king, to fight, which comes from the warrior, and to value someone enough to fight for them, which last is a gift from the lover. Conflation of the archetypes. As we have noted, scholars have shown a tendency to conflate the four foundational archetypes of mature masculinity, and this is one of Butler's failings. While he does an admirable job discerning the stages of the life of a magus, he tends to collapse the king and the warrior archetypes into the magician. He correctly recognizes that there is very little lover energy in most magicians. The magician is the most disembodied archetype of the four. Given the tangled web of interaction between the four, it is easy to see how they can be confused. The magician combines with the warrior, and only occasionally the lover, influencing many human professions. But the closest relationship is between the magician and the king. The institution of sacred kingship seems to have arisen, at least in Africa and Central Asia, from the office of rainmaker or shaman. In other areas of the world, the most difficult struggles were between tribes rather than against the weather, and kings there came from the warrior class. But in all sacred kingships, the warrior was believed to mystically embody the vital center of the created world. Through him, the various dimensions of reality came together, working harmoniously for the good of all things. All of the king's offices thus grew out of the shaman's responsibilities. Before the king, it had been the shaman's office to bridge the gaps between the underworld, the earthly plane, and the heavens. It was the shaman who had first imposed order upon chaos, through the force of a powerful will and by intuitive directive from the self. Thus it had been the shaman once who constellated the axis mundi, the center of the world, for his tribe to build their lives around. There's much room for scholarly disagreement over when exactly these shamanic duties were taken over by the king, and also why this happened. And because of their similar tasks, it can be difficult to make a clear distinction between shaman and king. What scholars find difficulty unraveling, the popular culture has confused even further. Sacred kings were always believed to embody magical powers, including the power to heal their subjects and kingdoms, and the power equally to strike them down. Certain magicians have likewise been popularly vested with kingly attributes. Jesus the magician was believed by the earliest Christians to be the true king of Israel. Later worshippers dubbed him Christ, Pantocrator, the cosmic king. The three magi who came to worship the infant Jesus, the three astrologer magicians, probably from Persia, borrowed by the Gospel's author from an ancient account of Zoroaster's birth, are often called kings. In Mexico, They are the three magician kings, and we hear this association clearly in an English carol. We three kings of Orient are. Yet it is worth discriminating between the magician and the king in order to identify which energies are operative in different situations. The king's realm includes a political sphere, which the magician rarely enters into, except for the shaman in the limited context of a traditional society. The king is fundamentally concerned with creative ordering and structure, where the magician is more concerned with the liminal areas outside of structures. The king is the most inclusive of the archetypes. In a mature personality structure, he reigns over the other archetypes and brings order to the whole self. But since the magician's focus is inward, he is an introverted and withdrawn archetype. Perhaps the clearest distinction can be made between the two in the context of sexual relations. The king is always in an intimate, erotic relationship with the queen. The magician, unlike the king, is rarely fully related to any feminine energy. The magician archetype has its own contrasexual component, see Appendix C, but a man who is possessed by the archetype rarely has a deep sexual involvement with a woman, and most usually is asexual. His androgyny offers him complete autonomy. Some few shamans are and were gay. While this doesn't preclude a relationship with the anima, homosexuality clearly renders a full relationship with a woman impossible. And of course, it precludes any offspring. The magician is split off, in the very essence of his structure, from full sexual expression. The man whose dominant archetype is the magician experiences ecstasy primarily in his mind and heart. He may also feel it in his body, contained and channeled through dance, song, or artistic expression, but he will not be able to experience sexual ecstasy. He will have his muse, as Dante had his Beatrice, but just as Dante never enjoyed her carnally, he will never experience full embodiment with a flesh and blood woman. The magician's bipolar shadow. The precocious child demonstrates a young form of magician energy. The unusually gifted child may be either a socially outgoing overachiever or extremely withdrawn and painfully shy. In traditional societies, gifted children are closely watched for signs of developing shamanistic capabilities. The fully expressed archetype, even in a child, integrates and transcends its bipolar shadow. Most often, however, we encounter its shadow forms. The bipolar shadow of the immature magician manifests as the trickster, on the one hand, and the innocent, on the other. These immature shadow forms are often carried forward into the adult years. A man caught in the bipolar shadow demonstrates internal psychological splitting, inordinate self-involvement, and dysfunctional behaviors. Maturity always involves the integration of psychic opposites and the transcendence of inner divisions. The system of the bipolar shadow we have delineated is analogous to the Adlerian realization that personality disorders appear in both passive and active modes. Our model also fits well with Hegelian thought, in which the universe moves forward through a process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Alfred North Whitehead sees an adventure of ideas luring the created world forward in tiny increments he calls occasions. These occasions interact with God, or an archetype from a psychological perspective, resulting in a creative advance. The Whitehead model of forward movement, like the Hegelian, is directly parallel to the action of the ego, when it is able to integrate the warring opposites of the bipolar shadow and so transcend the shadow system. Most significantly, our theory is in accord with Jung's conception of the conjunctio oppositorum, in which opposites are reconciled through the transcendent function. Jung believed the ego's essential task was to hold opposite points of view, opposite impulses, emotions, and imaginal realms in tension, not allowing either pole of the dialectic to disappear into the unconscious. Eventually, this titanic struggle, if held in consciousness and suffered and endured, would produce a transcendent third option that had not been felt or imagined before. Our theory emphasizes, in a way that Jungian psychology since Jung has not, the vital importance of the ego in relation to the dynamic archetypal structures. If the ego is not properly accessing the archetype as a whole, including the bipolar shadow integrated into the archetype as a transcendent third, then the ego will be possessed by the shadow and left oscillating between the shadow's two poles. One pole will lead to positive inflation, or to the explosion of the ego, and the other pole will cause the implosion of the ego, or negative inflation. When the two poles are integrated into a transcendent third, they lose their pathological impact. In their resulting fusion, their pathology is transformed into a creative advance, reminiscent of St. Paul's Christ, whose death is swallowed up in victory. The key to this transformative experience is the action of the ego. It must position itself for the maximum apprehension of the intimation of the archetype above space and time, in the world of the spirit, or the collective unconscious. The ego acts like an attractive body, as do the three elements of the archetype, each exercising a kind of gravitational pull on the others. In the collective unconscious, the archetype is whole, with the shadow fully integrated into it. The ego functions properly as an occasion for the archetype's embodiment in space and time. In the fragmenting dimension of space and time, the archetype appears to the ego largely in its bipolar shadow form, communicating only intimations of its wholeness. The ego must perceive the wholeness sufficiently well to keep it from mistaking the fragments of the shadow for the archetype as a whole. The bipolar shadow is akin to the Symplegades, the clashing rocks between which the ego must steer a middle course, guided by its intuition of the archetype, lest it be destroyed. If the middle course is managed, the ego fashions the vital ego-archetypal axis, by which energy exchange is made possible. The ego needs the lure of the archetype in order to experience creative advance. And the archetype needs the ego in order to become augmented and enriched for future creative action in the world. By the ego's action, the opposites of the bipolar shadow can be reintegrated into the archetype as a whole. The ego's methods for achieving this include analytical techniques such as dream interpretation and active imaginations. With the assistance of the magician, intuitions and whole patterns arise in the right brain and are translated into logical left brain arguments. The magician uses the left brain's technological and rational processes. From the right brain, he marshals imaginative, intuitive, and inspirational energies. None of the archetypes can be located in any one part of the brain. The magician is manifested most fully in the shaman, who manages a balanced access of both hemispheres of the brain. As we've mentioned, research into modes of thought indicates that women tend to access the right and left brain more holistically than men do. The shaman, too, uses the modes of perception and thought equally. In some ways, his modus operandi is more a woman's than a man's. Perhaps this accounts for his asexual or occasionally homosexual orientation. The shaman and schizoid phenomena. Some scholars have noted the similarity between the shaman's altered state of consciousness and schizophrenia. Others have noted the similarities, but pointed out crucial differences. It is true that the shaman's otherworldly journeys involve alien entities, both hostile and friendly. In psychological terms, we would describe these aliens as entities within the unconscious, both collective and personal. Perhaps the shaman's ego consciousness resides in his left brain, and its forays are into the right brain. The entities would then be images produced by the right brain for the benefit of the voyaging ego. The corpus callosum, the neuronal bridge between the left and right brain, would become exceptionally activated, facilitating a flood of impulses between the two hemispheres. Schizophrenics demonstrate just such a lowering of the natural inhibitions against left and right hemispheric communication. There is evidence that something similar may occur in those suffering with multiple personality disorders. In The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, controversial author Julian Jaynes links the mental processes of modern schizophrenics with the processes of our human ancestors before the development of ego consciousness. He believes modern ego consciousness began sometime in the 9th century BC. Before this time, he argues that all people, and particularly seers and prophets, experienced the nearly continuous eruption of right brain images and voices into left brain processes. In the absence of ego consciousness, people lived their lives heeding directives from the voices of the right brain. Those serving shamanic functions, the oracle at Delphi, for example, were especially sensitive to these voices. They heard the gods in much the same way that modern schizophrenics hear their voices. Although aspects of Jaynes' theory are doubtful, it may well be that intuition and poetic inspiration are related to schizophrenic phenomena. We believe the dysfunctional magician is definitely schizoid. He displays characteristics that, if pushed to an extreme, seem to invite schizophrenic traits. Those who argue against an identification of schizophrenic and shamanic states of consciousness point out, with justification, that a schizophrenic's voices are almost always persecuting and hostile, whereas a shaman's visions are often positive and self-affirming. There's little question that a budding shaman undergoes severe psychological disruption, in which he often experiences himself as being dismembered and eaten by various gods or demons. He dies to his old mode of ego consciousness and is reconstituted with the aid of inner helpers. After this ferocious initiation, he finds a more integrated method of being human. Unlike the schizophrenic, he retains his ego. He becomes the master of the spirits rather than their passive victim. It may be that any major life crisis involves a sudden and wrenching open of communication between left and right brain. If so, the altered state of consciousness that results is always marginally related to schizophrenic states of consciousness. But even so, the magician archetype in its fullness actually frees the ego from possession by the gods, reconstituting ego structures with the aid of inner helpers, power animals, and spirit guides. Thereby, the ego grows stronger with an enhanced sense of integrity and capability. The constellation of the magician. When the magician is constellated in a man, several things happen. First of all, the man becomes a quester. He starts looking for a magus to guide him. In Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Richard Dreyfuss plays the part of an ordinary man. He has his kids, his wife, and his pickup, and he's going along quite contentedly with his life until he has an encounter with what Jung called the numinous. In his case, a UFO that almost lands on his truck. After that point, his life is never the same again. He becomes a quester. When you start on a quest, you may not have the slightest idea of what you are looking for. You are looking for the magician. Some people travel through 20 or 30 cults looking for the real magician. But the goal being sought isn't out there in the world. It is deep inside. And one of the purposes of an initiation is to teach that simple truth. An initiatory sacred geography is the second phenomenon to unfold once the archetype of the magician is constellated. Your whole life becomes structured according to the archetype of initiation. Once you become a quester, you embark on a pilgrimage in sacred geography, and you will remain on it until you have run the course. The third thing to happen is the search for a transformative space. This transformative space is the place where an initiation can be completed, and a quester can be discharged from his quest. When people speak of a power spot, they are referring to a place in the sacred geography that is transformative. These places are special and rare, and this is why the shaman's role in locating, consecrating, and stewarding the energy of a transformative space was so vital to his people. Under the guidance of the magician energy, appropriately accessed, we can brave the perils of our inner worlds. Our deaths are preludes to our rebirths as we become more wholly human. In chapters to come, we will explore the nature of the quester, his initiation, and the sacred spaces he is looking to discover.